I've spent countless hours in airport terminals, federal buildings, and sitting across from some of the sharpest legal minds in the country, picking their brains about where the average American goes wrong when dealing with law enforcement. And if there is one thing that consistently fascinates me, it's this weird, almost magical belief that exists out there in the public consciousness. This idea that there is a secret combination of words, a verbal silver bullet, that can instantly dissolve a tense situation with a police officer. People are obsessed with the magic phrase. They want to know what to say to make the handcuffs disappear, to make the ticket vanish, to end the stop. So, let me ask you something, and I want you to be really honest with yourself here. If a cop pulled you over right now, or stopped you in the airport, or approached you on the street, what is the very first sentence you think would get you out of there the fastest? Think about it. What are the magic words? Drop your answer in the comments below, because I have a feeling your answer is going to be very, very different from the reality of how this actually works. I'm going to tell you right now, the answer might surprise you, and it's probably not what you've seen in a viral TikTok or heard from that guy at the barbecue who claims he knows the law. The 4 words that actually force a cop to end any stop are not an insult. They are not a demand, and they are certainly not, "I know my rights." In fact, screaming "I know my rights" is usually the fastest way to extend a stop from 10 minutes to 2 hours, especially if you're in a jurisdiction where the officer has a bit of an ego. No, the real power phrase is much quieter, much more strategic, and it relies entirely on one of the most fundamental yet misunderstood concepts in American criminal procedure: the difference between a consensual encounter and a seizure. The 4 words are simply, "Am I free to go?" Now, I know what you're thinking. That sounds too simple. It sounds weak. It sounds like something a nervous person would say, not something a legal eagle would drop to assert their dominance. But that's precisely where you're wrong, and that's precisely why this works. You have to understand the psychology of the officer and the black-letter law of the Constitution simultaneously. When you ask, "Am I free to go?" you aren't just asking a question. You are posing a legal and administrative dilemma to the person holding the badge. You are forcing them to make a choice. And that choice, once made, dictates the entire legal trajectory of the encounter. Let's break this down, because the depth of this is something travelers and drivers alike miss all the time. In the United States, law enforcement interactions are broadly categorized into 3 tiers. You have the consensual encounter, which is just a chat. You have the Terry stop, which is a brief investigatory detention based on reasonable suspicion. And you have an arrest, which requires probable cause. The vast majority of traffic stops and airport interactions start in that first gray area, the consensual encounter. The officer wants to keep it consensual because it gives them the most leeway. They can ask you questions, they can ask for consent to search, and you, the citizen, are technically free to walk away at any time. But here's the kicker. Most people don't know they're free to walk away. They feel detained the moment those lights flash in their rearview mirror, or the moment a uniformed officer walks up to them at the gate. This is where our 4 words come in. "Am I free to go?" is the question that shatters that illusion. It is the verbal scalpel that cuts through the social pressure of the situation and gets to the legal heart of the matter. When you ask that question, you are forcing the officer to articulate the legal basis for your detention. If you are truly in a consensual encounter, they have to say yes. They have to tell you that you are free to leave. And once they say those words, you have a choice. You can leave. The stop is over. You just ended it. But here's where the depth of this strategy really comes into play, and this is the part the YouTube gurus and internet lawyers often forget to tell you. The officer doesn't have to let you go if they have reasonable suspicion. If they have a reason to believe you've been involved in a crime, they can detain you. So when you ask, "Am I free to go?" and they say, "No, you are not," you have just gained an incredible piece of information. You now know, officially, that you are being seized under the 4th Amendment. You are no longer in a consensual chat. This triggers a whole new set of protections. It means the clock is now ticking on a constitutional timeline. In a Terry stop, the detention can only last as long as it takes to confirm or dispel the officer's suspicion. It can't be dragged out indefinitely. It also means that if they don't have that reasonable suspicion, any evidence they gather after that "no" is potentially suppressible in court. Think about how many people get caught in the net simply because they are too polite or too scared to ask that one simple question. I've seen it happen in airports more times than I can count. You have a traveler, maybe they're a little nervous because it's their first time flying alone, or they're running late, or they just have one of those faces that an overzealous TSA officer or a plainclothes cop doesn't like. The officer approaches them, flashes a badge, and starts asking questions. "Where are you coming from? Where are you staying? How long are you here for? Mind if I look in your bag?" The traveler, conditioned from childhood to respect authority, answers every question. They hand over their phone. They open their luggage. They are cooperating fully, all while standing in a public terminal, completely unaware that they have the absolute right to simply say, "I'd rather not answer questions, and I'd like to be on my way." If that traveler had simply looked the officer in the eye and asked, "Am I free to go?" the entire dynamic shifts. The officer is now on the back foot. They have to make a decision. Are they going to detain this person based on a hunch? They can't. A hunch isn't reasonable suspicion, so 9 times out of 10, in an airport scenario where there's no specific evidence, the officer will wave them on. They'll say, "Yeah, go ahead, have a nice flight." And just like that, the encounter is over. The potential for a fishing expedition, for a consensual search that finds that forgotten pocket knife or that legal but suspicious amount of cash, is completely neutralized. You didn't have to be rude. You didn't have to be confrontational. You simply asked a clarifying question that forced the encounter back into its legal box. Now, I have to give you a serious warning here, and this is where real-world consequences come into play. The way you ask this question matters. The context matters. Your demeanor matters. If you bark, "Am I free to go?" with veins popping out of your neck, you are not invoking your rights. You are escalating a situation. You are challenging the officer's authority in a way that is going to make them dig their heels in. They might find a reason to detain you. They might find a reason to write you a ticket for jaywalking that happened 3 blocks ago. They might suddenly remember that your taillight looked a little dim. You have to understand that police officers are human beings. They have egos. They have bad days. They have biases. Asking, "Am I free to go?" should be done calmly, politely, and with genuine curiosity. It should sound like you are genuinely seeking clarification, not like you are reciting a line from a legal textbook to trap them. The nuance here is incredible, and this is why travelers especially need to understand the environment they're in. If you're in an airport, you're dealing with a complex jurisdictional nightmare. You have local police, airport authority police, sheriffs, TSA, and sometimes even FBI or ICE agents floating around. Each one has different authorities. TSA, for example, is not a law enforcement agency in the traditional sense. Their job is transportation security, not criminal investigation. If a TSA agent starts asking you questions about your travel itinerary that seem invasive, asking, "Am I free to go?" is a perfect response because they generally cannot detain you for criminal investigation purposes. They can detain you if you set off a metal detector or refuse screening, but for casual chatting in the terminal, you're free to go. You're always free to go until they have a reason to hold you. I remember talking to a lawyer friend of mine who specialized in Fourth Amendment cases, and he told me about a client of his who was stopped coming off a cruise ship. Customs and Border Protection officers have enormous power at the border, including the ability to search your devices without a warrant. But this guy was in a parking lot, not at the actual border checkpoint. An officer approached him, plain clothes, and started asking about his trip. The guy, a seasoned traveler, just smiled and said, "Officer, this is a big parking lot. I'm just trying to get to my car. Am I free to go, or are you detaining me?" The officer paused, muttered something, and walked away. That guy saved himself from a potential hours-long forensic examination of his laptop because he understood that the border search exception doesn't extend infinitely into the parking lot. He forced the issue. He made the officer define the encounter. This brings us to the deeper, more philosophical layer of this entire discussion. Why are these 4 words so effective? It's because they flip the script from compliance to accountability. Most police encounters are based on a social script where the citizen is passive and the officer is active. The officer asks, the citizen answers. The script is so ingrained that even when we know we have rights, we feel rude asserting them. We feel like we're being difficult. Asking, "Am I free to go?" breaks that script. It doesn't refuse to answer a question. It simply asks for the parameters of the conversation. It says, "Before I continue engaging with you, I need to know what this is. Is this a voluntary chat, or is this a legal detention?" And because officers are trained to keep people talking, to keep the encounter consensual for as long as possible, they often have to admit that, yes, it's voluntary. And once it's voluntary, you can end it. Let's talk about the traffic stop scenario, because that's where most people will encounter this. You get pulled over for speeding. The officer comes to your window, asks for license and registration. You hand it over. That part is not consensual. If you are pulled over for a traffic violation, you are seized for the duration of that traffic stop. You cannot just ask to leave while the officer is running your license. That's not how it works. The magic of "Am I free to go?" comes into play after the initial business of the stop is concluded. The officer comes back to your window, hands you your license and a ticket or a warning, and says, "Okay, you're all set." At that moment, legally, the stop is over. You are free to go. But then, the officer might linger. They might say, "Hey, before you go, I noticed some air fresheners in your car. You mind if I take a quick look around?" Or, "So where are you heading tonight? You seem a little nervous." This is the danger zone. This is where the consensual encounter begins after the legal detention has ended. Most people, still in the mindset of the stop, think they have to answer. They think the officer is still in charge. They don't realize they are now standing on the side of the road in a brand new, entirely voluntary interaction. This is where you ask the question. You look at the officer, you smile, and you say, "Officer, am I free to go? You said I was all set, so I'd like to get back on the road." You are not refusing consent yet. You are simply asking if you are allowed to leave. If the officer says yes, you leave. The stop is ended. If the officer says no, then you know that any further detention is now potentially unlawful, and you have a recording in your head, and hopefully on your phone, of them extending the stop without reasonable suspicion. The power of this question is that it doesn't give the officer an opportunity to ask for consent to search. It short-circuits the entire process. They can't ask to search your car if you're already driving away. They can't ask you about your plans if you're already gone. It forces the issue to a head, and for the traveler, the driver, the citizen, it is the cleanest, safest, most legally sound way to extract yourself from a situation that is no longer required by law. However, I need to inject a massive dose of reality here, and this is the part that really grinds my gears about some of the legal advice you see online. There are people out there who treat these 4 words like a get-out-of-jail-free card, and they apply it in situations where it is not only useless, but dangerous. If you are under arrest, you are not free to go. Asking the question won't change that. If you have a warrant, you are not free to go. If the officer has probable cause to believe you just committed a crime, you are not free to go. The question isn't designed to get you out of handcuffs. It's designed to prevent the handcuffs from ever going on in the first place. It's a prophylactic measure. It's a tool to ensure that you don't accidentally consent to your own loss of liberty. Another critical angle to consider is the location of the stop. In an airport, the rules of the road are different. The sterile area past security is a legal wonderland where your expectation of privacy is greatly reduced. But even there, the question holds power. If a cop approaches you at your gate while you're waiting for a delayed flight, you are in a public place. You are not doing anything wrong. They may be looking for drug couriers or people with outstanding warrants. If they start chatting you up, asking to see your ID, you can politely ask, "Am I free to go? I really need to make a phone call before my flight boards." They can't hold you without reasonable suspicion. If they try to, and you're not under arrest, you're looking at a potential civil rights violation. I want to share a hypothetical that really illustrates the depth of this. Imagine you're coming back from a vacation in Colorado, where recreational marijuana is legal. You land in a state where it's not. You're walking through the airport, and a narcotics officer, who profiles passengers based on their checked luggage tags, approaches you. He starts asking about your trip. You're tired, you're carrying a heavy bag, and you just want to get to the taxi stand. If you engage with him, you risk a host of problems. Maybe you say something inconsistent. Maybe he asks to pat you down. Maybe he asks to search your bag. If you have a legal souvenir, like a t-shirt with a pot leaf on it, that could be enough for him to dig deeper. But if you simply stop, look him in the eye and say, "Officer, I'm really tired and I just want to get home. Am I free to go? Or are you detaining me for a specific reason?" You have just taken all the wind out of his sails. He has nothing. He has to let you go. You have just used 4 words to protect your freedom and your time. This strategy is not about being anti-police. It's about being pro-Constitution. It's about understanding that the 4th Amendment protects the right of the people to be secure in their persons against unreasonable searches and seizures. Asking if you are free to go is the most direct way to determine if a seizure is occurring. It is the most respectful way to clarify the nature of the interaction. It puts the onus on the officer to either act within the law or to admit that they are acting outside of it. Let's talk about the psychology of the officer for a moment, because I've spent enough time around law enforcement to know how they think. A good cop, a professional cop, respects a citizen who knows their rights and asserts them politely. It makes their job easier. If they have no reason to hold you, they want you to leave so they can find someone who actually is doing something wrong. The cops who get upset when you ask this question are the ones who were planning on using the gray area of a consensual encounter to go on a fishing expedition. They were hoping you'd be too timid to ask. They were relying on your ignorance. When you ask the question, you signal to them that you are not an easy target. You are not going to be intimidated. And in many cases, that is enough to make them move on to someone else. I've heard stories from lawyers about clients who were stopped for absolutely no reason, subjected to humiliating searches, and arrested for minor offenses that were only found because they talked too much. In almost every single one of those cases, the outcome could have been avoided if the person had simply asked, at the very beginning of the encounter, "Am I free to go?" It wouldn't have guaranteed they got away with a crime if they were actually committing one. But for the innocent traveler, the person just going about their day, it is the shield that prevents them from being pierced by the sword of suspicion. Now let's get into the weeds a little bit about what happens after you ask. Let's say you ask, and the officer says, "No, you're not free to go. I'm investigating something." Your next step, and this is crucial, is to ask, "Am I being detained or am I under arrest?" This is the follow-up punch. If they say you're being detained, that's a Terry stop. You are not under arrest, but you are not free to leave. At this point, in most jurisdictions, you do not have to answer questions beyond identifying yourself in a traffic stop context. You can say, "I do not consent to any searches, and I would like to remain silent. I want to speak to a lawyer." But that's a whole other article. The beauty of the initial question is that it prevents you from getting to that point if there's no basis for it. One of the biggest mistakes I see travelers make is that they treat airport security and law enforcement interactions as if they are on a job interview. They feel they have to be likable. They feel they have to explain themselves. They feel that if they just give a good enough story, the nice officer will let them go. That is a dangerous fallacy. Law enforcement officers are not looking for good stories. They are looking for inconsistencies. They are trained to pick apart your narrative. The more you talk, the more rope you give them to hang you with. The safest course of action is to say as little as possible, and the safest way to end the conversation is to ask if you are free to leave. I want to address the fear that some people have that asking this question will make them look guilty. This is the single biggest psychological barrier to asserting your rights. We have been so conditioned by TV shows and crime dramas that only guilty people lawyer up and only guilty people want to leave. The innocent person, the narrative goes, has nothing to hide, so they should just cooperate. That idea is not only wrong, it's dangerous. Innocent people have everything to lose. They have their time, their privacy, and their dignity to lose. They have the risk of a misunderstanding escalating into an arrest. They have the risk of having their car impounded because an officer misinterprets something they said. Cooperating with a fishing expedition is not a virtue, it's a gamble. Think about it this way. If a stranger came up to you in the mall and started asking to look in your purse or your backpack, you would tell them no without a second thought. You wouldn't worry about looking guilty. You would simply recognize that it's none of their business. But when that stranger has a badge and a gun, suddenly our social calculus changes. We feel compelled to comply. Asking, "Am I free to go?" restores that natural boundary. It reminds both you and the officer that you are a citizen with rights, not a subject with obligations. The application of this in the travel context is vast. From the moment you park your car at the airport to the moment you land at your destination, you are in a zone of heightened police presence. You have TSA at the checkpoint, but you also have law enforcement roving the terminals. You have customs when you return from an international trip. You have state troopers on the highway leading to the airport. In every single one of these interactions, the principle is the same. If the interaction is not based on a specific, articulable suspicion of a crime, you have the right to end it. And the way you end it is by asking if you are free to go. I recall a specific incident that happened to a colleague of mine, a journalist who travels frequently for work. He was in a major airport waiting for a connecting flight, and he was typing away on his laptop in a quiet corner. An airport police officer approached him and asked to see his ID. My colleague, being well-versed in these matters, looked up and said, "Sure, but first, am I free to go?" The officer was taken aback. He said, "What do you mean?" My colleague said, "I mean, am I required to show you my ID, or is this a voluntary request? If it's voluntary and I'm free to leave, I'd prefer to just continue working." The officer mumbled something about it being voluntary and walked away. My colleague later told me that if he had just handed over his ID, the officer would have run it, possibly found nothing, but then might have started asking where he was going, why he was traveling alone, and on and on. By asking the question, he avoided a 20-minute interruption and a potential fishing expedition. Now, let's consider the flip side. What if you ask, and the officer lies? It happens. They might say, "You're not free to go," even when they have no legal basis to detain you. This is a critical moment. If they say you're not free to go, you need to assess the situation. Are they physically blocking you? Are there multiple officers? Is your freedom of movement actually restrained? If they say you're detained, you should comply with that detention physically, but you should continue to assert your rights verbally. You can say, "Okay, I do not consent to any searches, and I am exercising my right to remain silent. I want a lawyer." You do not resist arrest, even if you believe it's unlawful. You save that fight for the courtroom, not the sidewalk. This is why the question is so powerful. It forces the issue to a head early, when the stakes are low. It's better to find out at the beginning of an encounter that you are being detained, rather than 20 minutes into a conversation that you mistakenly thought was voluntary. By asking the question, you force the officer to either escalate the encounter legally or de-escalate it by letting you go. You take the control out of their hands and put it back into the framework of the law. One of the most common scenarios where this plays out is with DUI checkpoints. At a DUI checkpoint, you are not free to leave without going through the checkpoint. That's the nature of the stop. However, once you've been through the initial screening and an officer waves you forward to a secondary area to ask more questions, the dynamic changes. If they start asking you where you've been, if you've been drinking, and you want to leave, you can ask, "Officer, am I free to go?" If they have no reasonable suspicion of intoxication, they have to let you go. If they don't, any evidence they gather after that point could be thrown out. This principle applies even in non-criminal contexts. I've seen stories of people being stopped by fish and game wardens while hiking, or by security guards at private facilities. The question works anywhere the concept of freedom of movement exists. It's a universal check on authority. It reminds the person in power that you are aware of your status as a free person. I want to take a moment to talk about the audio-visual component of this. In today's world, almost everyone has a smartphone. If you are in a public place, you have the right to record law enforcement, provided you don't interfere with their duties. If you ask, "Am I free to go?" having that interaction recorded is invaluable. It creates an objective record of the officer's response. If they say you're free to go and then try to grab your arm, you have evidence. If they say you're not free to go without articulating a reason, you have evidence of a potential unlawful detention. Recording is not about being aggressive, it's about creating a transcript of the event. It's insurance. However, I must warn you about the intersection of recording and asking the question. If you are recording and you ask the question, do it calmly. Don't wave the phone in their face. Hold it at your side or on your chest. The goal is to capture the audio, not to create a confrontation. A smart officer, upon seeing a phone, will often be more professional. A less smart officer might get angry. You have to gauge the situation. Your safety is always paramount. If you are in a remote location with no witnesses, it might be wiser to comply and challenge later than to risk an escalation. The law is on your side, but the law can't unpunch you in the face. Let's go back to the traveler. You're at the airport. You've just cleared security. You're putting your shoes back on, and a man in a windbreaker flashes a badge and asks you to step aside. This is a common tactic. They target people who look rushed or confused, or who fit a certain profile. They take you to a small room or a corner and start asking about your travel history. They might ask to see your phone. They might ask you to empty your pockets. This is the moment. This is where you need the 4 words. You need to look at them and say, "Am I free to go? I have a flight to catch and I'd like to get to my gate." If they say no, then you need to ask, "Am I under arrest?" If they say no, then you need to ask, "Then why am I being detained?" You are peeling back the layers of the onion. You are forcing them to articulate the reasonable suspicion that justifies holding you. In many cases, they won't have it. They are on a fishing expedition, hoping you'll be the one who confesses to something or who has a bag full of cash they can seize for civil forfeiture. If you assert your rights calmly and clearly, you become a much less attractive target. You become harder work, and cops, like anyone else, prefer easy work. They will often cut you loose and go find someone who looks more compliant. Now, I have to be honest with you about the limits of this strategy. It will not work if you are actively breaking the law in plain sight. If you have a joint hanging out of your mouth in an airport, asking if you're free to go is not going to help you. If you are driving 90 miles an hour and you get pulled over, you're not going to ask if you're free to go before handing over your license. The question is for the gray area, the post-stop chatter, the casual approach. It's for the moments when authority is being used without a solid legal foundation. The beauty of the English language and the law is that sometimes the simplest questions are the most profound. "Am I free to go?" is not a demand. It's not an insult. It's a humble inquiry that has the power to restore balance to an inherently unbalanced interaction. It acknowledges the officer's position while simultaneously reminding them of yours. It says, I respect your role, but I also respect my rights. Help me understand which one is in play right now. I want you to imagine how different your last interaction with law enforcement might have been if you had asked this question. Maybe it was a simple traffic stop. The officer gave you a warning, but then stood there for 5 minutes talking about where you were going. You were polite. You laughed at his jokes. You answered his questions. He let you go. But what if he hadn't? What if your answers had led him to ask for consent to search? What if you had an open container in the back seat you forgot about? That 5 minutes of just chatting could have changed your life. Asking the question cuts that off. It protects you from the unknown. This is especially true for younger travelers. If you are under 25, you are statistically more likely to be stopped and questioned. You are also statistically more likely to be nervous, and nervousness is often misinterpreted by officers as deception. If you are a young person and a cop approaches you in an airport or on the street, your best move is to politely ask if you are free to go. It removes you from a situation where your youth and anxiety could be used against you. Let's also talk about the international traveler coming into the U.S. Customs and Border Protection has immense authority. At the primary inspection point, you are not free to go until they say so. You have to answer their questions about your citizenship and the purpose of your trip. That's the law. But once you are released from primary, you are in the baggage claim area. If a secondary inspector or a random cop approaches you there, the rules change. You are no longer at the border in the legal sense. You are in a public area of the airport. At that point, the "am I free to go?" question becomes relevant again. If they haven't pulled you into secondary inspection officially, you can ask if you are being detained. Many travelers don't realize that the border's special rules don't follow you out to the curb where the taxis are. I recall reading about a case where a man was stopped by DEA agents at a bus station. He fit a profile. They asked to search his bag. He asked, "Am I free to leave?" They said no. He then said, "Then I don't consent to a search." They searched anyway and found drugs. The court later ruled that because they had no reasonable suspicion to detain him, the search was illegal. That question, "Am I free to leave?" was the key that unlocked the entire Fourth Amendment analysis. Without it, he would have just been a guy who consented to a search. With it, he became a guy who was unlawfully seized. The lesson here is clear. You have to create a record. You have to establish the boundaries. You cannot rely on the officer to tell you that you are free to go, because they have no incentive to do so. They want to keep you talking. The burden is on you, the citizen, to ask the clarifying question. It is your responsibility to know when you are a willing participant in a conversation and when you are a captive subject of an investigation. Now, let's address the critics who say this is all just legal jargon that doesn't work in the real world. They will tell you that if you ask this question, the cop will just get pissed off and find a reason to arrest you. And you know what? Sometimes that happens. We live in a country where not every cop is a saint, and not every interaction ends well. But ask yourself this. If a cop is willing to violate your rights because you politely asked a clarifying question, what do you think that same cop is willing to do if you just meekly go along with everything they say? If they are the kind of person who would arrest you for asking a question, they are also the kind of person who would arrest you for the tone of your voice or the look in your eye. You cannot control their bad behavior by being compliant. You can only document it and fight it later. The difference is that by asking the question, you are building your legal case. You are establishing that you did not consent to the encounter. You are creating a moment that a lawyer can point to and say, "Here, Your Honor, this is where my client asked to leave and the officer refused without cause." Without that question, the officer can simply say, "We were just chatting. It was consensual." And in many cases, the court will believe the officer, especially if you are someone with a record or if you fit a certain demographic. The question is your proof. It's your anchor in the stormy sea of he said, she said. In the travel world, time is money. You have flights to catch, connections to make, rental cars to pick up. A 15-minute delay from a consensual encounter could be the difference between making your flight and sleeping in the airport. So asking if you are free to go isn't just a legal strategy. It's a practical time management tool. It says, I value my time, and unless you have a legal reason to take it from me, I'm leaving. I want to leave you with a final thought on this. The power of "am I free to go" lies not in the words themselves, but in the mindset they represent. It represents a citizen who is aware, who is engaged, and who refuses to be a passive subject of authority. It is the question of a free person. And in a country that prides itself on freedom, that question should never be controversial. It should be the most natural thing in the world. So the next time you're in an airport, or driving down the highway, or just walking down the street, and a uniformed officer starts a conversation that you didn't initiate, remember those 4 words. Keep them in your back pocket, and when the time is right, ask them. You might be surprised at how quickly the stop ends. Now, I've given you a lot to think about, and I've shared the strategy that legal experts and savvy travelers have used for years to protect their liberty and their time. But I want to circle back to the question I asked you at the very beginning. What did you think the magic words were? Was it something aggressive, something technical? Did you think you had to know the exact statute number? I'm genuinely curious to hear your thoughts, your experiences, and even your skepticism. Have you ever used this phrase? Have you seen it work? Do you think it would work where you live? I read the comments, and I take them seriously because the conversation we have here is just as important as the information I provide. So take a second, scroll down, and tell me what you think. Let's get a discussion going, because the more we talk about these things, the more we understand them, and the better prepared we all are for that next unexpected encounter.